The chamber was silent, save for the rustle of silk. Servants worked quickly, their hands steady as they pinned a veil upon the trembling girl. She was barely 10 years old, her body thin, her eyes wide with fear. Yet tonight she was to be a bride. Outside, the cathedral bells rang as if in celebration, their sound echoing across the city. To the people, this was a royal triumph. To her, it was the end of childhood. At the far end of the hall, the king waited. He was decades older, a man shaped by power, by ambition, and by the belief that his throne demanded such a sacrifice. The union had been arranged not for love, nor even for alliance, but for control. And so, before she could even understand what marriage meant, she was delivered into his bed. This is not a story of romance. It is a story of politics, of ambition, of abuse hidden behind gilded doors. In courts across Europe, such unions were not rare. Girls barely past infancy were married to men old enough to be their fathers or grandfathers, their bodies used as tokens in the Game of Thrones. This child bride, whose name history often buries beneath titles and treaties, became one of many whose life was sacrificed on the altar of dynastic power. But before we dive further, let me welcome you, re-listening to Whispers of History, where we uncover the darkest truths buried beneath royal crowns and golden thrones. Here, the past is not polished, but raw, unsettling, and true. If this story already grips you, make sure to subscribe so these whispers never pass you by. And tell me, as you hear this tonight, where are you listening from, and what hour of night holds you? It always amazes me how history's shadows reach across oceans to find you. Her story begins with the desperation of kings. In the 15th and 16th centuries, Europe's thrones were fragile, bound together not by the will of the people, but by the marriages of bloodlines. A daughter could be traded like coin, her worth measured not in innocence or youth, but in the strength of alliances she brought. The church, expected to guard morality, instead sanctioned these unions. Popes issued dispensations, priests blessed the ceremonies, sermons declared the marriages holy. And so, childhood was stolen, sealed with a kiss beneath a golden altar. But behind the pomp and incense lay the truth. These girls were not brides by choice. They were pawns. They were dressed, veiled, paraded, and handed over to men whose power silenced their cries. And when the cathedral bells ceased, when the feasts ended, when the doors to the bridal chamber closed, the true horror of their fate began. This is the story of one such child, a 10-year-old girl forced to trade her dolls for a crown, her games for a bed, her laughter for silence. Her marriage was celebrated as triumph, yet it became a curse. Through her suffering, we uncovered the brutal truth of how power consumed innocence, and how thrones were built upon the broken bodies of children. And so our journey begins, not with a fairy tale, but with a child in a wedding gown, trembling beneath the weight of a crown too heavy for her head. The sight of a child in a bridal gown may horrify us today, yet for monarchs of the past, such a scene was not only accepted, it was expected. To them, childhood was not a stage of innocence to be protected. Childhood was a resource, something to be bartered, spent, and sacrificed for the sake of power. In the courts of medieval and early modern Europe, no marriage was private. Every union was political, and every bride was a symbol. Kings did not wed for love. They wed for treaties, for land, for wealth, and above all, for survival. And so, when crisis struck, when borders faltered, when enemies gathered, when dynasties teetered on the brink, the solution was often found not in armies, but in daughters, from Spain to France, from Austria to England. Girls as young as 10 or 12 were draped in silk and led to the altars of men old enough to be their fathers or grandfathers. Some were betrothed even earlier, their futures sealed before they had even learned to write their own names. In the eyes of their families, they were not children. They were contracts. But here lies the darker truth. These contracts were sanctified by the very institutions meant to guard morality. The Church, whose teachings held the power to condemn or absolve, chose to bend. Again and again, popes issued dispensations, smoothing away the barriers of age and even of blood. Priests blessed ceremonies where trembling children stood beside graying kings, intoning prayers that cloaked exploitation in the language of divine order. Imagine the scene. A child, scarcely tall enough to reach the altar, veiled in lace, her hands shaking as she repeated vows she barely understood. The congregation bows, the choir sings, and the organ thunders, not for a romance, not for a union of equals, but for the binding of power. On paper, it was marriage. In truth, it was surrender. Behind palace doors, the consequences were immediate. These girls, their bodies unready, were thrust into the role of wives and mothers. Some did not live long after their weddings, their young frames broken by pregnancies they could not endure. Others survived, but only by silencing their own voices, learning to smile in public while hiding their despair in private. Their lives were not their own. They belonged to the dynasties that had traded them away. The people saw. Servants whispered in kitchens, midwives wept behind closed doors, commoners muttered in the streets. They knew the truth, that these unions were not blessings, but bargains, and yet nothing changed. Power was a hunger that silenced pity. And so we arrive at the heart of our story. A girl only 10 years old, plucked from childhood and delivered into the bed of a king. Her name may have been lost in treaties, her voice erased from chronicles, but her fate was recorded in the structure of power itself. She was not the first child bride, nor the last, but her story captures the brutal logic of dynasties that saw nothing sacred in innocence. The question was not whether she wanted this marriage. The question was whether the throne demanded it. And when the answer was yes, no plea could stop the march to the altar. Her father signed the papers. Priests gave their blessing. Nobles gathered in finery, their faces masks of approval. Outside, bells rang in celebration, the sound carrying across a city that cheered without knowing the cost. And in the center of it all, a girl stood in silence, her crown too heavy for her head, her veil too long for her small frame. When the ceremony ended, the feasts began. Goblets of wine were raised, toasts echoed through gilded halls, musicians played as courtiers danced. Yet beneath the laughter was unease. Everyone knew the truth. The groom was old, the bride was a child, and the union was less a blessing than a bargain struck in desperation. The night ended as all such nights did. The guests departed, the music ceased, and the child was led to her chamber. History rarely records what followed. Chroniclers preferred silence, for some truths were too uncomfortable to set down in ink. But we can imagine the terror, the confusion, the crushing weight of expectation that descended upon her as the door closed behind her. This is where the story shifts. For while the marriage was celebrated as triumph, it was in fact the beginning of decline. The dynasty believed it had secured itself with this union. Instead, it had bound itself to a curse not of sorcery, but of its own making, born of ambition, sanctified by faith, and carried on the fragile shoulders of a 10-year-old girl. And so, beneath the glittering crowns and golden altars, the stage was set. A king believed he had secured his legacy. A court pretended to cheer. A church declared it holy. And the child bride, silent and trembling, became the symbol of everything power could destroy. The wedding day arrived, draped in ceremony. The city awoke to the peal of bells, their echoes rolling over rooftops and across narrow streets. To the people, it was a holiday, a spectacle, another chance to glimpse royalty parading in finery. But within the palace walls, the mood was different. Nobles shifted uneasily. Courtiers whispered in corners, and even the clergy who would bless the union carried a tension in their eyes. For though the ritual would be cloaked in grandeur, everyone knew the truth. The bride was a child. The cathedral glowed with light. Candles flickered from iron stands, casting shadows against gilded altars. The air was heavy with incense, sweet and suffocating. Nobles filled the pews in silence, their jeweled garments shimmering in the candlelight. Their faces were carefully composed, solemn, obedient, but their minds could not escape the grotesque fact of what they were about to witness. At the altar stood the king. He was no young groom awaiting his bride with nervous anticipation. He was a seasoned monarch, his hair streaked with grey, his body weighted by age and rule. He wore his crown with authority, his robes embroidered with gold, his expression fixed into calm resolve. There was no trace of hesitation. He believed in the necessity of this marriage. To him, it was not scandal, but strategy. Then, the great doors of the cathedral swung open. The congregation turned, and silence fell. There she was, the bride, 10 years old, her body fragile beneath layers of silk and lace, her veil so long it trailed across the floor behind her. She clutched a bouquet that seemed almost larger than her hands could hold. Step by step, she moved forward, guided more by the hands of her attendants than by her own will. Beneath the veil, her face was pale, her lips pressed together as though holding back words that could never be spoken. The procession was slow, deliberate, every movement watched by hundreds of eyes. Some looked away, unable to reconcile the innocence of the child with the solemnity of the vows she was about to take. Others stared coldly, convincing themselves that what they witnessed was the will of God, the design of dynasties, the unbroken tradition of power. When she reached the altar, the priest began his words. His voice rose in ritual cadence, intoning blessings that had echoed in that cathedral for centuries. But this time, the words sounded hollow. He spoke of holy matrimony, of love and duty, of bonds sanctified by heaven. Yet all could see that this was no union of equals. It was a contract, written not in scripture but in politics, and sealed with a child's silence. The vows came next. The king's voice was steady, firm, unshaken as he repeated the ancient promises. The girl's voice, by contrast, was barely audible, each word a whisper pushed from trembling lips. She spoke because she had to, not because she understood. She agreed because there was no other answer. When the rings were exchanged, a murmur rippled through the congregation, for in that moment, symbols became reality. The child was no longer daughter, no longer granddaughter. She was wife, a title given not by nature, but by decree. The priest raised his hands high, declaring the marriage sanctified by heaven itself. The organ roared to life, choirs erupted in song, and bells rang furiously from the cathedral tower. To the city beyond, it was celebration. To those within, it was silence covered by sound. After the ceremony, the court moved to the feast. Tables were laden with roasted meats, golden breads, and sugared fruits. Goblets of wine spilled over in endless toasts. Musicians played, dancers twirled, and courtiers forced laughter into the air. Yet beneath the surface, unease lingered. For no amount of music or wine could erase the memory of what they had just witnessed. A girl dressed as a queen, bound to a man who could have been her grandfather. The bride herself sat quietly at the high table, her small frame swallowed by the great chair carved with royal emblems. She lifted food to her lips, but ate little. Her eyes, when she dared look up, met only stares, some pitying, some curious, some hard with calculation. She had become not just a bride, but a spectacle. And then, as the night waned and the feasting slowed, came the moment that all had expected, yet none dared to speak of openly. The guests began to depart. The music softened. Servants cleared the tables, and the child was led from the hall toward her chamber. What followed, history does not describe in detail. Chroniclers turned their pens away, preferring to record the grandeur of the ceremony rather than the horror of its consummation. Yet the silence of the records speaks louder than words, for everyone in that palace knew what it meant. A child had been given to a king, and the marriage was not only to be celebrated, but completed. The court pretended to rejoice, the church declared it holy, and the city outside rang with bells of triumph. But, in truth, a crime had been committed under the guise of duty. A crown had been secured, but at the cost of innocence. And as the doors to her chamber closed, the dynasty believed it had bound itself to strength. In reality, it had chained itself to a shadow that would darken the throne for years to come. The morning after the wedding, the palace was quiet. The feasts had ended, the music silenced, and the revelry of the previous night hung heavy in the corridors like smoke that refused to clear. Servants moved carefully, speaking in hushed tones, as if the walls themselves were listening. They carried trays of food, water, and perfumed cloths to the bridal chamber, but their eyes betrayed unease. They knew what it meant to enter that room. When the doors finally opened, little was revealed. The king emerged first, composed as ever, his expression unreadable. He nodded to his attendants, gave orders for the day, and walked away as if nothing unusual had occurred. Behind him, the young bride was glimpsed briefly. Her veil was gone, her face pale, her step slow. The servants who saw her whispered that her eyes seemed empty, as though she had left part of herself behind in the night. The chronicles of the court are almost entirely silent on this chapter. Official records speak of a joyous wedding, of blessings granted, of alliances strengthened. But in their silence lies the truth. For even those who wrote for kings knew that some details could not be set down. Better to polish the memory than to confront the reality of what had been done. Yet the people who lived within the palace could not ignore it. Gossip spread quickly. Some servants said the girl had cried throughout the night, her sobs echoing faintly through the corridors. Others swore she lay still and silent, resigned to what had been forced upon her. Midwives and attendants, those closest to her, whispered of bruises hidden beneath silk sleeves, of fevers that came suddenly in the days that followed, of a child's body straining under the weight of demands no child should endure. Among the nobles, talk was more careful. Few dared speak openly against the king, for his wrath was swift and merciless. Instead, they whispered in corners. Their words carried like shadows through the halls. Some framed it as necessity, a sacrifice for the good of the dynasty. Others muttered of curses, warning that no throne secured by such unions could endure. Still others remained silent, their silence itself a form of protest. Beyond the palace, the common people speculated as well. Markets buzzed with rumor, taverns with dark jokes, churches with murmured prayers. Some pitied the girl, seeing her as a lamb led to slaughter. Others, hardened by centuries of royal excess, shrugged it off as another scandal among many. But a few whispered of divine punishment, recalling stories of dynasties ruined by their own sins. The church, which had sanctified the marriage, now faced a quiet dilemma. Priests preached of duty and obedience, insisting that the union was holy. Yet even in their sermons, hesitation crept in, for they, too, had eyes, and they could not deny the fragility of the girl, the unease in the air, the way the king's victory already felt like a curse. Inside the palace, the bride herself grew more isolated. No longer a child, no longer free, she was expected to embody the dignity of a queen. She appeared at ceremonies, her small frame hidden beneath heavy robes and layers of jewels. She smiled when commanded, bowed when instructed, and spoke only when spoken to. Yet those who looked closely could see her detachment. Her gaze often wandered, her answers delayed, as though her mind had retreated to a place no one else could reach. Her daily life became a prison of ritual. Lessons in etiquette, hours spent in prayer, endless ceremonies where her presence mattered more than her voice. She was paraded before courtiers as proof of the dynasty's strength, even as her own spirit weakened. Servants said she spent long hours alone, staring out windows, her hands clutching small objects, a ribbon, a wooden doll, remnants of a childhood that had been ripped away too soon. Still, the king pressed forward as though nothing were amiss. He attended councils, issued decrees, and made plans for the future. To him, the marriage was already a success, a symbol of his authority and a shield against foreign powers. He had silenced critics by bending the church, by bending his court, by bending his own family to his will. And yet, in the shadows, the unease grew, for even kings cannot silence every whisper, and the whispers were everywhere. Servants carried them down staircases, courtiers traded them in coded phrases, priests muttered them in confessionals. The story of the child bride spread beyond palace walls, carried across borders by foreign envoys. In letters sent to other courts, ambassadors described the union with veiled horror. They wrote of a young girl transformed into a queen overnight, of a dynasty willing to sacrifice innocence in the name of power. One letter, preserved in the archives of a rival court, summed it bluntly: Spain secures its throne by devouring its own children. And perhaps that was the truest description of all, for in binding a child to a king, the dynasty had crossed a line that even centuries of politics could not erase. They had transformed their heir into a symbol not of strength, but of decay. The young bride, meanwhile, bore her new role with silence. She had no choice. Her tears brought no comfort, her resistance no release. She learned quickly that her survival depended on compliance, that her life was no longer her own, but a performance staged for others. She became queen in name, prisoner in truth. And in the quiet of her chambers, she began to understand the terrible reality. This was not the end of her ordeal. It was only the beginning. The wedding may have silenced critics for a moment, but in the brutal logic of dynasties, marriage was only the first step. The true measure of a queen was not her crown, her beauty, or her obedience. It was her womb. A queen existed to produce heirs, and until she did, she was incomplete. From the moment the vows were spoken, pressure fell upon the child bride like an invisible weight. Nobles watched her every movement. Courtiers whispered at banquets, scanning her face for signs of change. Servants carried rumors through corridors. Had her appetite shifted? Had she fainted? Had her figure altered? Each passing month, without news, bred more speculation. The king's patience wore thin. To him, the union had been a calculated act of power, and its success depended on children. An heir born of this marriage would silence scandal, secure the throne, and justify every prayer whispered over the cathedral altar. But as months turned to seasons and seasons into years, the cradle remained empty. The girl, scarcely more than a child, began to wither under the strain. Her body, still growing, was pressed into the unnatural role of mother. Physicians were summoned, prescribing tonics brewed from bitter herbs and minerals ground into dust. Midwives placed charms around her neck, whispering prayers against barrenness. Priests assured the court that God would not forsake his chosen monarchs, yet nothing changed. Her health faltered. Servants spoke of fainting fits, of long days when she remained in bed, her body weak, her eyes hollow. She was seen clutching her stomach in pain, her hands trembling as she tried to rise during ceremonies. The very rituals meant to display her as a queen instead exposed her fragility, and still the pressure did not relent. At banquets, courtiers leaned closer, studying her plate. Did she eat more than usual? At prayers, they stared at her figure beneath the layers of silk. Every laugh, every silence, every glance was analyzed as evidence. She was no longer a girl, no longer a bride, not even a queen. She was reduced to a vessel, a body upon which the fate of a dynasty rested. The whispers deepened beyond the palace. In marketplaces and taverns, people began to speak of divine justice. God punishes the proud, some said. What king weds a child and expects heaven's blessing? Rumors spread that the union was cursed, that no healthy heir could come from a marriage so unnatural. Priests loyal to the crown condemned such talk as heresy, yet even in their sermons, doubt crept in. Their words rang hollow when the evidence was plain. The cradle remained empty, the queen remained barren. Some compared the situation to the infamous Charles II, the bewitched king whose deformities and illnesses had been the result of generations of inbreeding. They warned that the dynasty was repeating the same mistakes, chaining itself to bloodlines already weakened. Others whispered of darker retribution, imagining angels striking down the unborn before they could take their first breath. Within the palace, the atmosphere thickened. The king, once confident, grew irritable, prone to bursts of anger when his counselors dared mention succession. He blamed physicians for incompetence, midwives for negligence, even the queen herself for weakness. Yet behind his fury lay fear. He had staked everything on this union: his authority, his legacy, his claim to divine right. If no heir came, what remained? And what of the girl at the center of it all? She withdrew further into silence. At public ceremonies, she moved like a shadow, her face expressionless, her voice quiet. In private, she was said to spend hours alone, staring at the crucifix above her bed, whispering prayers no one could hear. Servants sometimes found her with small trinkets from her childhood, a ribbon, a carved toy, clutched tightly in her hands, as though holding on to fragments of the life she had lost. The court saw her as a failure. The people saw her as cursed. But to history, she became something else, a symbol of how power devours innocence, how dynasties consume their daughters to preserve their thrones. One winter night, as the bells of the cathedral tolled midnight, a servant overheard her whisper words that chilled him to his core. "Perhaps God spares me," she said softly, her voice breaking. "Perhaps it is not I who am barren, but this dynasty." Those words, repeated in kitchens and corridors, spread like fire. They were dangerous words, words that questioned the very foundation of royal authority, yet they resonated. For even those who had once cheered her wedding began to wonder if she was right. The dynasty had demanded a sacrifice. It had taken a child and placed her in a king's bed, believing the union would secure its power. But instead of stability, it reaped silence. Instead of heirs, it reaped suspicion. And in the emptiness of the cradle lay the echo of divine judgment. The court could pretend, the church could preach, the king could command, but the truth was inescapable. Power had demanded too high a price, and the cost was not only the innocence of one girl, but the future of an empire. The years that followed did not bring stability. They brought unraveling. What had been meant as a triumph, the union of a king and his child bride, became instead a festering wound upon the dynasty. The absence of heirs gnawed at the throne like rot in the foundations of a palace. And as the silence of the cradle stretched from months into years, the king's confidence dissolved into desperation. At council meetings, his temper flared with increasing violence. Ministers who dared speak of succession were silenced with threats. He raged at physicians, accusing them of incompetence when their remedies failed. He dismissed midwives, cycling through one after another in hopes of a miracle. But no matter how many prayers were whispered, no matter how many concoctions brewed, the outcome never changed. The queen remained frail, her womb silent. The king's health faltered as well. Once robust, he grew pale and irritable, his hands trembling as he signed decrees. Some whispered he was haunted, others that he was cursed. He clung to his child bride with the desperation of a drowning man grasping for air, not out of affection, but out of fear. For without her, without heirs, his dynasty stood on the edge of collapse. Meanwhile, the queen herself became little more than a shadow. She moved through ceremonies with mechanical grace, her crown heavy on her small head, her robes hiding the toll carved into her body. Servants described her as walking in silence, her face expressionless, her eyes fixed on some distant horizon. She was present, yet absent, a hollow figure draped in jewels. At night, she wandered the corridors of the palace alone. Some claimed to have seen her stop before portraits of past queens, staring into their painted eyes as if searching for guidance. Others whispered that she lingered in the chapel long after the candles burned out, kneeling in silence, lips moving in prayers unheard by all but God. The people began to see her less as queen and more as omen. Her youth, her fragility, her silence, all seemed to symbolize a dynasty consumed by its own excess. Market gossip turned bitter. A child cannot carry a kingdom, some said. This marriage was never blessed. In taverns, drinkers muttered that Spain had traded its future for a scandal. And in the pulpits, even priests began to tread carefully, no longer praising the union so boldly, but warning instead of the sins of pride. The palace grew suffocating. Whispers crept through its halls like smoke. Ambassadors from foreign courts sent letters filled with veiled mockery. They described the queen as a pale and silent girl, unsuited for the burdens she carries. They described the king as a man possessed by his own ambition, blind to the ruin he brings. The scandal was no longer hidden. It was a spectacle, and Europe watched with morbid fascination. Inside the council chamber, rival factions hardened. Some argued the marriage had doomed the dynasty, that new alliances must be sought elsewhere. Others insisted loyalty to the king demanded silence. Still others whispered of rebellion, of removing the child queen from her place and replacing her with another bride. None dared act openly, but the tension was palpable. For the queen, the isolation was unbearable. She had no allies. Her family had abandoned her, the church had betrayed her, and even the women of her household were divided between pity and envy. She was surrounded by people, yet utterly alone. One story survives from this time, told by a maid who claimed to have served her. The maid recalled finding the young queen seated at her chamber window, staring out into the gardens below. In her lap lay a small wooden toy, worn smooth by years of play. It had been hers as a child, a relic of the life stolen from her. The maid said she whispered only one sentence: "They gave me away before I could give myself." The words spread through the palace, repeated in hushed tones. They captured the essence of her fate: a childhood taken, a life dictated, a body transformed into a bargaining chip. As the years dragged on, the sense of doom deepened. Famine struck the countryside, wars drained the treasury, rebellions flared in provinces once thought secure. Each misfortune was seen as a sign, a warning that the throne itself was cursed. The people's faith in their rulers crumbled, and with it, the very legitimacy of the dynasty. The king refused to see it. He pressed forward with stubborn pride, insisting his marriage was holy, his decisions ordained by God. But the cracks were too deep to hide. Even among his closest advisors, doubts grew louder. And in the silence of the queen's chambers, despair grew heavier. By now, she was no longer a child in appearance, but neither was she truly a woman. Her body bore the scars of failed pregnancies, her spirit the weight of endless expectation. She had been turned into a symbol of obedience, of sacrifice, of decay. Yet in truth, she was only a girl who had been forced to grow old before her time. One stormy night, thunder shaking the palace walls, a servant claimed to have overheard her prayers. Her voice, faint and trembling, carried words that struck like prophecy. "If this is the cost of crowns, then let them fall." Those words, like an echo of doom, spread through the palace. They terrified some, emboldened others, and haunted the king most of all. For even he, in his desperation, could not deny that the empire he had tried to secure through his child bride was beginning to crumble. The dynasty had demanded her innocence, her body, her silence, and now it demanded its own survival from a girl who had nothing left to give. The twilight years of the king's reign were marked not by triumph, but by shadows. His once mighty dynasty, built on conquest and crowned in gold, was unraveling before his eyes. Wars drained the treasury, enemies pressed on every border, and famine hollowed the land. But above all else, one fact gnawed at the heart of the monarchy: the cradle remained empty. Years had passed since the wedding that had shocked Christendom. The child bride, once paraded as a symbol of alliance and divine blessing, had grown older in years, yet remained broken in spirit. Her body had endured failed pregnancies, her mind had carried the weight of endless scrutiny, and her soul had been crushed by isolation. She lived not as queen, but as ghost, a figure present in ceremonies, yet absent from life. Her voice rarely heard, her laughter long forgotten. For the king, the silence of heirs was a humiliation too great to bear. His courtiers spoke of providence, of patience, of God's mysterious will, but his own rage grew poisonous. He struck out at his counselors, dismissed priests, even accused his wife of betrayal. In his desperation, he turned to superstition. Sorcerers were consulted, relics pressed into the queen's hands, prayers whispered in candlelit chambers, but no miracle came. The people outside the palace had already made their judgment. To them, the marriage was not a union blessed by heaven, but a curse cast upon the throne. Whispers turned into open mockery. Pamphlets circulated in secret, mocking the king as a man so desperate for heirs that he had sacrificed his own bloodline. Priests, once defenders of the crown, now spoke cautiously of sin and punishment, their sermons laced with warnings. The queen herself became the embodiment of that judgment. She was spoken of not as a woman, but as a symbol. To some, she was a martyr, a child forced into sacrifice for the sake of power. To others, she was an omen, proof that God had withdrawn his favor from the dynasty. Wherever her name was spoken, it carried the weight of tragedy. Inside her chambers, she lived in near solitude. Servants whispered that she spent her nights in prayer, her hands clasped so tightly the knuckles turned white. Others claimed she paced endlessly, unable to rest, her eyes hollow with sleeplessness. Sometimes she was heard speaking aloud, not to anyone present, but to God, to the saints, perhaps even to the ghost of the childhood she had lost. As the king aged, his body betrayed him. His once commanding presence withered into frailty. Gout swelled his limbs, fevers clouded his mind, and his outbursts became more violent. He clung to power with iron fists, but his grip was slipping. When he looked at his queen, he no longer saw alliance or legitimacy. He saw failure. And yet he could not release her, for without her, the mask of authority would collapse entirely. The end came slowly, like the dimming of a candle. The king's death was not marked by glory, but by whispers of relief. Courtiers, weary of years of scandal and decay, turned their eyes to the future. But there was little future left to claim. Without heirs, the succession fractured. Rivals pressed claims, foreign powers circled like vultures, and the once mighty throne became a seat of weakness. For the queen, widowhood brought no freedom. Still young in years, she was old in sorrow. She lived on in the palace, but without power, without love, without purpose. History records little of her final years. Perhaps she faded into the silence that had defined her life. Perhaps she died quietly, another casualty of dynastic ambition. But her story did not die with her. Chroniclers, though cautious, could not erase the unease that lingered. Foreign observers recorded the scandal in their reports, and among the people, her memory became legend. The tale of a child forced into a king's bed, a dynasty undone by its own cruelty. Historians would later point to this union as part of the pattern of decline. Dynasties obsessed with purity, with bloodlines preserved at any cost, had created their own ruin. The marriage that was meant to secure power had instead exposed its corruption, and the image of the little girl in a bridal gown, walking down the aisle toward her grandfather's throne, remained etched in memory as a symbol of everything wrong with a system that consumed its own children. The final judgment, however, came not from courtiers or priests, but from history itself. Empires rise and fall, thrones are built and broken, but stories endure. And the story of the 10-year-old bride is not one of triumph or glory, but of tragedy. The tragedy of innocence sacrificed for ambition, of crowns purchased with suffering, of dynasties destroyed by their own sins. In the end, the bells that once rang in celebration of her wedding came to toll for the death of her dynasty, and in their mournful echoes, one truth rang clear: power that feeds on the innocent can never last.